There is a filing cabinet in a quiet archive room in Ohio that was never meant to be opened again. Inside it, not photographs, not official reports, but something far more dangerous. Typed transcripts, word for word records of conversations between a dying woman and a clinical psychiatrist. No theories, no speculation, just testimony. The woman's name was Edith Thorne, and in the final months of her life, she described a world that does not exist in any history book you have ever read. She didn't speak about myths, she didn't speak about legends, she spoke about neighbors, men who stood head and shoulders above everyone else, not as curiosities, but as workers, builders, blacksmiths, people who lived normal lives in a world that was not built for us. At first, the doctor thought it was dementia. That's what the files say. But then something happened that he couldn't explain. Her descriptions were too precise. She didn't just remember people, she remembered measurements, door handles placed so high she couldn't reach them, counters that required her father to lift her just to speak to a clerk, tools so large they made no mechanical sense unless the hands holding them were twice the size of ours. And that's when the investigation quietly shifted, because if she was imagining it, why does the physical evidence still exist? Why do buildings from the late 19th century still have proportions that don't match the human body? Why were entire records, especially the census from 1890, removed, destroyed, erased, as if they documented something that could not be allowed to remain? The official explanation says it was an accident, a fire, a clerical decision, but when you follow the sequence, the timing, the silence that followed, it doesn't feel like an accident. It feels like a reset. And Edith Thorne may have been one of the last people alive who remembered what the world looked like before it happened, because according to her, this world was not designed for us, it was inherited. And everything around you, the buildings, the tools, the measurements, they are not decorative, they are evidence of a population that was systematically removed, and a history that was carefully rewritten, so completely that today you don't even realize you're living inside it. The first thing you need to understand is that this story does not begin with giants, it begins with something much harder to dismiss: ergonomics. Because belief can be argued, but measurements cannot. If you walk into government buildings constructed in the late 19th century, especially across the American Midwest, you will notice something that feels wrong, even if you cannot immediately explain why. The ceilings feel too high. The doorways feel oversized. The proportions feel off. You've been told this is intentional, that it was done to inspire awe, to make citizens feel small in the presence of authority. But that explanation falls apart the moment you stop looking at the decoration and start looking at the function. Because decoration can be exaggerated. Function cannot. Take something simple like a door handle, not its design but its placement. In dozens of preserved buildings from that era, original handles are positioned at a height that does not align with the human body as we know it today. Not comfortably within reach, but significantly higher. High enough that for a modern person, opening the door becomes awkward, unnatural, inefficient, and that raises a question that should not exist. Why would anyone design a functional object in a way that makes it harder to use, unless it wasn't designed for you? This is where Edith Thorne's testimony becomes impossible to ignore, because she did not describe these anomalies as strange. She described them as normal. She remembered a post office where the counter was so high she had to be lifted just to see the clerk, not because the building was grand, but because the person behind the counter stood at a height where that counter made perfect sense. To him, it was standard. To her, it was unreachable, and to us it has been reframed as architecture. But the deeper you look, the more the pattern repeats. Bridges with railings that sit too high for comfort. Staircases with steps that break natural stride. Windows placed at heights that don't align with seated or standing positions. Individually, each detail can be dismissed. Together, they form a system that suggests something uncomfortable, that the environment itself was calibrated for a different body, a larger one. And this is where the narrative shifts, because if the buildings were not scaled for us, then the next question becomes unavoidable. Who were they scaled for? The answer does not come from myths, it comes from tools, hidden not in museums but in places no one thinks to look: old barns, salvage yards, agricultural collections. Places where objects are preserved, not because they are understood, but because no one bothered to throw them away. And in those places there exists a category of tools that should not exist at all. Iron plows with grip widths so wide that no normal human frame can operate them efficiently. handles spaced so far apart that using them would eliminate leverage entirely, unless the person holding them had an arm span far beyond ours. The same applies to logging equipment. Massive crosscut saws designed for motion ranges that exceed what the average human body can produce. If you try to imagine using them, the mechanics fail, the stroke is too long, the force cannot be maintained. But in archival photographs, you don't see struggle. You see ease. You see men standing in the snow, operating these tools with a posture that looks natural, balanced, effortless. And that is where the contradiction becomes undeniable. Because if these tools were impractical, they would not have been used. And if they were used, then they were built for someone who could use them, someone whose body matched the scale of the world they were working in. Which brings us back to Edith Thorne, because according to her, these people were not rare. They were not hidden. They were part of everyday life. Workers, builders, neighbors, integrated into society until something changed, until the world itself was adjusted. The moment you accept that the tools and buildings were designed for a different scale, the next layer reveals itself. Records. Because a population of that size does not simply exist without documentation. They would have been counted, measured, categorized, and for a brief moment in history, they were. The census of 1890 was not an ordinary record. It was the most detailed population survey ever conducted in the United States up to that point. It did not just list names. It recorded physical attributes, occupations, classifications that modern summaries never mention. It was, in effect, a complete snapshot of the human landscape at the edge of a transition, and then it disappeared. The official explanation is simple. A fire in the early 20th century damaged the records. What remained was later deemed unnecessary and authorized for destruction, case closed. But when you examine the sequence more closely, the explanation begins to fracture. The damage was not total. Large portions survived, enough to preserve, enough to archive. But instead, a decision was made, a deliberate one, to eliminate what remained, not immediately, not in panic, but methodically, as if the existence of those records posed a problem that could not be allowed to persist into the future. Because if those documents contained evidence of a population that no longer exists, then their survival would contradict everything that came after, and this is where Edith Thorne's account aligns with the timeline in a way that cannot be ignored. Because she did not describe a sudden disappearance, she described a process, a quiet, controlled relocation. She called it something that sounds harmless, rehousing, but what she described was anything but. Across the country, large institutions began to appear. Massive stone buildings with proportions that, once again, did not match the standard human frame, doorways tall enough to pass through without lowering the head. Dormitories with vaulted ceilings, built not for comfort, but for clearance. Officially, these were places of care. Sanatoriums, schools for the mentally unwell, facilities for those who did not fit into society. But according to Thorne, there was something else entirely: containment. She remembered the day a man named Silas was taken, a builder. Strong, capable, respected, not sick, not unstable, simply different. He was told his presence was no longer compatible with the world that was being built, that his biology had become a liability, and he was removed. Not publicly, not violently, but quietly, as if he had simply stepped out of the story. And once enough of them were gone, the second phase began, not removal, but modification. Entire towns were altered, not rebuilt from scratch, but adjusted. Doorways reduced, ceilings lowered, railings repositioned, not to improve function, but to redefine what normal looked like. And this is the part most people miss, because if you change the environment, you don't need to change the people. The next generation will grow into it, without ever questioning what came before. A child raised in a smaller world will never know it was once larger, and that is how a population disappears without leaving a trace, not by force, but by design. Which leads to the most disturbing question so far. If the people were removed and the environment was altered, then what else had to be changed to make sure no one would ever remember? What had to be changed was not just the physical world. It was perception itself. Because even if you remove the people, even if you alter the buildings, memory still remains. And memory is dangerous. So the next layer of this system was not structural, it was sensory. According to Edith Thorne, the world she grew up in did not just look different. It sounded different. She described a constant presence, something she called a hum, not noise, not machinery, but a low, stable resonance that seemed to exist everywhere, especially in cities. At the time, no one questioned it, because it was normal. It was part of the environment, like wind or distant thunder. But when you trace that detail, it begins to connect to something much larger. Cathedrals filled with massive pipe organs, bell towers tuned to specific frequencies, metal structures rising above buildings, shaped like antennas but never explained. We are told these were decorative, ceremonial, but what if they were functional? What if they were part of a system designed not to transmit information, but to sustain a condition? Thorne insisted that the people she described, the ones larger than us, were not just physically different, they were tuned differently. Their bodies responded to the natural resonance of the earth. They could feel it, hear it, exist within it. And then, that resonance was altered. Gradually, but deliberately, in the early 20th century, something subtle began to change. Bell systems were dismantled. Organ music shifted in pitch. Standards were introduced that redefined what was considered correct frequency. To most people, it meant nothing, a technical adjustment, a modernization, but to Thorne, it marked the beginning of something irreversible. She described the air itself becoming sharper, less stable, as if something foundational had been retuned, without anyone fully understanding the consequences. And this is where the narrative becomes deeply unsettling, because if a population depends on a specific environmental condition to function, then changing that condition does not just affect comfort, it affects survival. Thorne believed that this shift, this recalibration of the world's resonance, was not an accident. She described it as a form of pressure, a way to make the environment incompatible without direct confrontation, because if you can make a population unable to exist comfortably, they will disappear on their own. No conflict, no resistance, just gradual decline. And while that was happening, another process was unfolding in parallel, one that ensured the future would never question the past. Children, large numbers of them, moved across the country, separated from their origins, given new identities, new environments, new histories. They were placed into the newly modified towns, the smaller spaces, the adjusted world, and they were taught a story, a beginning point, a version of history that started where the transition ended. Everything before that was either simplified, distorted, or removed entirely, because a child with no reference will accept whatever they are given as truth. And when that child grows up, they will defend it, not because they investigated it, but because it is the only version they have ever known. This is how memory is replaced, not erased, rewritten, layer by layer, generation by generation, until the original version becomes impossible to reconstruct. And by the time people like Edith Thorne tried to speak, it was already too late, because what she described no longer matched the world around her, and anything that does not match reality is dismissed, not as evidence, but as imagination, which is exactly what makes the final piece of this system so effective, because once the environment is changed, once the records are destroyed, once the memory is rewritten, there is only one thing left to eliminate: proof. Proof is the one thing that can undo everything, because no matter how thoroughly a story is rewritten, no matter how completely memory is reshaped, physical evidence does not forget. It does not adapt, it does not agree to be reinterpreted. It simply remains. And that is exactly why it had to be removed, or at the very least, redefined. Take one of the most celebrated events in American history, the Great Exposition in Chicago at the end of the 19th century. You have been told it was temporary, a grand illusion built from fragile materials, designed to impress and then disappear, constructed in an impossibly short amount of time, dismantled just as quickly. But that explanation only works if you never look closely, because the structures documented in surviving photographs do not resemble temporary architecture. They resemble permanence, massive columns, symmetrical stonework, foundations that suggest weight, not decoration. And yet, we are told it was all superficial, a stage set, a facade, which raises a question that has no comfortable answer. Why would anyone build something so complex, so precise, so monumental, only to destroy it immediately unless it wasn't built? Unless it was found, prepared, presented one final time before being erased. Edith Thorne claimed she visited that exposition, and what she described does not align with the official narrative. She spoke of machinery halls where the controls were positioned far above the reach of the average person, not as an oversight, but as a standard. And in the photographs that remain, there are no ladders, no adjustments. Just men who appear to fit perfectly into a scale that does not match ours. And then the fire. The explanation is familiar. Accidental, unfortunate, but convenient. Because fire does not just destroy structures, it removes detail. It eliminates the ability to measure, to compare, to question. And when the remains are gone, all that is left is the story. But even after that event, even after the destruction, the evidence did not disappear completely, because not everything can be burned. Foundations remain. Substructures endure. And when modern demolition crews tear down buildings from that era, they continue to report the same anomalies. Staircases with proportions that disrupt natural movement. Basement chambers lined with materials that serve no clear purpose in a medical facility. Networks of metal embedded in stone, arranged with a precision that suggests function, not decoration. These are not isolated findings. They repeat, across locations, across decades, and every time they are discovered, they are dismissed, labeled as curiosity, misinterpretation, irrelevance, because acknowledging them would require something far more difficult, admitting that the world we inherited was not designed for us. And that brings us back to the final contradiction. If the official narrative is complete, then why does the physical world continue to disagree with it? Why do tools exist that we cannot use efficiently? Why do buildings contain proportions that do not match our bodies? Why do fragments of records appear only to be followed by gaps, silence, absence? Because when you step back and look at the pattern as a whole, it no longer feels random, it feels coordinated. A sequence, first. Identify what does not fit. Then, isolate it. Then, adjust everything around it so that no one notices it is gone. And finally, rewrite the story, not dramatically, not obviously, but carefully over time, until the replacement feels natural, until questioning it feels irrational, until anyone who remembers something different is no longer seen as a witness, but as a problem. Edith Thorne was one of the last. Her testimony survived, not because it was preserved, but because it was overlooked, filed away, ignored, left in a cabinet that no one thought to open. And yet, it aligns with the architecture, the tools, the gaps in the record, the silence where something should exist, which leaves you with a final realization that is difficult to escape. This was never about hiding something small. It was about removing an entire scale of reality and replacing it with one that feels manageable, controlled, reduced. Because a world built for something larger cannot be fully understood by something smaller. If everything you've just heard is even partially true, then you are not standing in the world you think you are. You are standing in a version of it, a reduced copy, a space that has been adjusted, calibrated, resized so precisely that you no longer notice what doesn't fit. Because you were never meant to, you were born into it, raised inside it, taught to accept its proportions as natural, its history as complete, its silence as normal. But silence is not the absence of truth. It is the result of something being removed. And once you begin to see it, it becomes impossible to unsee. The height of a doorway suddenly feels intentional. The depth of a counter feels misplaced. The scale of a tool feels wrong, not exaggerated, not artistic, but incompatible. As if you are interacting with objects that were never designed for your hands, your reach, your body. And that is the moment everything shifts. Because the question is no longer, did giants exist? The question becomes, why does the world still carry their measurements? Why do the buildings remember when the records do not? Why does the iron still hold the spacing of a grip that no modern hand can use comfortably? Why do entire chapters of documented history vanish right at the moment they should become most detailed? And perhaps the most unsettling question of all, if a population could be removed this completely, without leaving behind anything that cannot be explained away, then what else has already been adjusted, reduced, or erased without you ever realizing it? Because Edith Thorne did not leave behind a theory, she left behind a warning. She did not ask to be believed, she asked to be measured against the world itself, to compare what you were told with what you can see, touch, and verify. Because the truth, if it still exists, is not hidden in secret vaults. It is built into the environment around you, waiting, in every oversized doorway, every unreachable handle, every tool that does not make sense. Waiting for someone to stop accepting the scale they were given and start questioning whether they were ever meant to fit into it at all. So the next time you walk into a building and something feels off, don't ignore it. Measure it. Because the moment you do, you may realize something that cannot be undone. This world does not feel wrong because you are misunderstanding it. It feels wrong because it was never made for you. And if that is true, then the final question is not about the past. It is about the present. Are you living in your own world, or are you living inside the remains of someone else's?